Hello YouTube. Today I will tell you a story about lost treasures and some very interesting and sad times in the history of the country where I was born. It's an interesting story, and it will show you what people do for ideas and for treasures. And it has to do with the lost gold of Russia's last emperor. Emperor Nicholas II of all Russia, Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, was the last Czar to reign over the huge Eurasian country. In that country, they had a very brave and bright young officer of the Russian Imperial Navy who took part in the very dangerous Arctic explorations, defended Russia's Port Arthur against the Japanese imperial forces, and as the Vice Admiral in command of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, valiantly set minefields next to the Turkish shores in the World War I. His name was Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak. And when the February Revolution of 1917 came about, and later the same year the communists, or the Bolsheviks as they were called, when they grabbed the power away from the weak democratic provisional government, he decided to act. A very bloody civil war broke out in the former Russian Empire. Fortunes and treasures were lost and hidden in the most unlikely places. To save them from the various armies, warlords, bandits, and adventurers. We will skip some pages in the biography of Kolchak, who was a controversial Russian military scientist, explorer, naval reformer, a one-time lecturer in the United States War College, and Minister of War and Navy in the Siberian Directory, one of the governments that came about in the lands of the former Russian Empire. Now, I want to talk about the gold that was in the hands of the Admiral. And the trail of the gold bullion in the Admiral's possession begins in November of 1918, when Kolchak proclaimed himself to be the supreme ruler of Russia and commander-in-chief, establishing an autocratic military dictatorship. He also promoted himself to the rank of Admiral. Kolchak's adversaries and bitter enemies were the Bolsheviks and the Red Army. I need to tell you, my grandfather served in the Red Army in one of the better units at the time. He was in cavalry. He was a young man who joined the Red Army. He was given boots, a horse, and a sword, and a rifle. And he joined it, and that's how he survived. This was a very complicated, very sad, very bitter time in the history of Russia. And the story of Kolchak will show you what I mean. The bloody Russian Civil War was fought on many fronts, and some of the fiercest battles were in Siberia and the Far East. Kolchak's rule was largely brutal and bloody. His officers were corrupt and arrogant. And this has earned him hatred and scorn of many people from all strata of the Siberian population. Now, the Reds, or the Communists, they practiced terror tactics, but unlike their enemies, they possessed able leadership, a disciplined, dedicated political party, and fiery, clever, and false propaganda. They claimed they would give land to the peasants, factories to the workers, but in reality, the people of the former Russian Empire finally ended up with Stalin and his terror machine. Remember it when you hear political promises today, in whatever country you are, because sometimes demagogues promise a lot, but all you wind up with are concentration camps or labor camps and totalitarian dictatorship. Initially, Kolchak's government controlled the area from Lake Baikal to the river Volga. Kolchakia, as the leader of the Soviet Union, later Vladimir Lenin referred to it. And Kolchak's government had the support of the Czechoslovak Legion. After the Allies defeated Germany in November 1918, they continued their intervention in the war against the Communists to prevent a worldwide communist revolution and social upheavals. There was another reason for the Allied intervention: to restore a Russian front against Germany. Admiral Kolchak had been helped by the Allies and was recognized by them as the legal government of Russia. But the only interventionists who represented a real danger to the Bolsheviks were actually the Japanese, who established themselves through the Russian eastern territories. In July of 1918, Japan landed 72,000 troops in Vladivostok and spread them throughout eastern Siberia, claiming the territory as part of Japan. The United States Army landed their soldiers to secure the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Japanese irritated Americans. They skillfully disrupted the Allied operations through the brutal and bloody Kazakh General Ataman Semyonov, who ruled as a dictator and basically was a Japanese spy puppet. The United States branded him as a thief and a renegade. At the time, he operated in the area of Ulan-Ude, that's slightly to the west of Vladivostok. In April of 1919, the Red Army began a counter-offensive against Kolchak's troops and forced them to flee to the Urals, to the east. Kolchak retreated eastward. He was trying to flee Russia through Vladivostok. His armies were accompanied by thousands of refugees who were fleeing the communists and their policies. Now, the winter of 1919 to 1920 was very harsh, cold, merciless, and devastating. Deep snows covered Siberia, and thousands of people died along the Trans-Siberian Railroad every week. Scores of wolf packs had plenty of food to eat that bloody winter. Human corpses along the railroad they made the predatory animals very lazy that winter. Human predators, however, craved other precious items on the trains of the fleeing supreme ruler. What happened to the Tsar's imperial treasure that was transported in 28 or 29 railroad cars under the guard of Kolchak's armored train? The treasure consisted, as far as we know, in 1919, of 505 tons of Russian imperial banks gold bullion, gold powder, as well as some jewels of the Tsars. Kolchak used to pay for military supplies and provisions straight from his Russian imperial reserve of 645 million golden rubles, which was seized by White Guards. That's how the armies who were fighting the communists, that's how they were called. They were seized by White Guard forces in the city of Kazan in August of 1918. I have researched, scanned Russian and Western sources, and was able to put together the following information. Much of Kolchak's army had deserted, and mostly those who were loyal and dedicated to him were left with the admiral. Kolchak retreated to Irkutsk, losing most of his following, especially the Czechoslovaks, former POWs from World War I, who controlled the 4,000-mile-long Trans-Siberian Railroad. The Czechoslovaks, as Slavs, they didn't want to fight against their brother Slavs, the Russians. The Austrians compelled them to enter the war against Russia on the southwestern front, but the Czechoslovaks surrendered to the Russians instead of fighting them. Now, when the civil war broke out in Russia, the Czechoslovak Legion, comprised of the former POWs, was ordered to evacuate from Ukraine to Vladivostok, to be picked up by Allied ships and sail on to England. But they revolted against the Bolsheviks, who tried to disarm the 30,000-strong military formation, and they seized the most important railroad of the Russian Asia, And so Russia was cut off from Siberia and its grain supplies. The Trans-Siberian Railroad connected a number of major industrial centers. It ran from Moscow through Samara, Omsk, Krasnoyarsk, and Irkutsk. It ran around Lake Baikal through Chita, into Manchuria, and through the town of Harbin, and terminated at the far eastern city of Vladivostok. Those who controlled the railroad controlled communications, access to vital supplies, and the only transportation link through Siberia and the Russian Far East. So in December of 1919, Kolchak was stopped at the town of Nizhneudinsk. The Czechoslovak commanders were not eager to expedite his retreat. Meanwhile, local Red guerrillas assumed control of the town. They were eager to grab Kolchak and his, so to say, gold bullions. They declared the town an independent republic, but the legionnaires whisked Kolchak and the gold out of there. Now the train reached Irkutsk, that's to the west of Lake Baikal, accompanied by a small detachment of Czechoslovak legionnaires. In Irkutsk, Russian White Army troops and the Czechoslovaks were guarding the train. They did not trust each other. In January of 1920, Kolchak proclaimed another anti-communist Russian military leader, Denikin, to be his successor as leader of the White Armies. And on January 15, 1920, French General Jeannin, because French officers were nominally in charge there, and the Czech General Jan Surowy handed Kolchak over to the Irkutsk provisional government, friendly to the Soviets, whose revolutionary military committee executed the admiral and his prime minister, and took possession of all of Siberia. Admiral Kolchak faced his executioners with composure and courage, and he was shot on February 7, 1920. But who acquired possession of the Kolchak's gold? The Czechoslovaks, who were evacuated from Russia soon thereafter, allegedly did get some of it. The French General Maurice Jeannin, commander-in-chief of the Allied troops in Siberia, received 1/3 of the gold bullion from the Russian imperial treasury under Kolchak's control. This gold was rumored to have become the first national treasury of the newly created country of Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovak legionnaires turned the rest of the gold reserve of the Russian Imperial Bank to the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, that's those that were socialists who were helping the Soviets, in Irkutsk. They were allies of the Soviets at the time. And in turn, these people handed the gold to the arriving communists. I did not find conclusive evidence that this is what really happened. Those naive allies of the Bolsheviks eventually were eliminated by the Soviet secret police or perished in the Soviet concentration camps. And they left no memoirs, recollections of those heady days in Irkutsk. But we gotta talk about the Japanese connection. There are at least two conflicting conjectures as to whereabouts of the gold bullion. Leonid Petrov, a Russian researcher of Asia at the Australian State University and an expert on both Koreas, made a presentation in 2002 in Tasmania. He stated that of those 505 tons of Russian gold seized by Kolchak, some 182 tons, worth 191 million golden rubles. They were settled in Japanese banks. In order to destroy any proof of such transactions, Japanese finance ministers Takahashi promptly ordered the Imperial Mint in Osaka to melt this gold into Japanese nuggets and coins. But how did the Japanese get Russian gold bullion? They did receive some other sizable gold treasures of Russia from the unsavory White Guard leader, Kazakh General Semyonov, an enemy of many players in the Siberian arena of the time, including the Americans. Kolchak, who was a patriot in his own way, a brave and resolute man, and Grigory Semyonov, an odious chieftain and a puppet of the Japanese military, they disliked each other ever since they met. But the admiral promoted Semyonov to the rank of general lieutenant and appointed him the field commander for the struggle against Bolshevism in the Far East. Still, they were quite different people. The Japanese never cared for Kolchak. They did not want to see any viable Russian government in Asia. Yet they received hundreds of tons of Russian gold from Kolchak, apparently for the weapons they were to sell to him. Now, Valen Sirotkin, a prominent Russian historian and professor of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry, supplied more details about the Japanese connection. Professor Sirotkin, who passed away in 2005, had for a number of years worked on how to reclaim the Russian treasures and real estate abroad. He was interviewed by Voice of Russia program back in 1998, and this is what he revealed. Admiral Kolchak sent 300 tons of gold to Japan in 1919. There are documents confirming that this gold is still in Japan, and in line with the 1916 and 1919 accords, the Japanese side was to return the gold since it did not send weapons to the supreme leaders, to the supreme leader Kolchak. They never sent the weapons, but they got the gold. The Japanese government had received a huge interest rate from this gold, and Japan does not deny it. But exactly how many tons of the gold bullion in his possession did Kolchak send to Japan? And what happened to the missing tons of gold? Now, the Japanese also received Russian gold from a White Guard Major General Pavel Petrov, who entrusted 20 boxes of gold coins and 2 boxes of gold bullion to Colonel Isome of the Japanese forces that occupied that part of Siberia at the time. Petrov wanted to cross through Manchuria and not lose the gold to numerous foreign mercenaries and local brigands like the Chinese mounted bandits, Mazhok. They were operating in Siberia. He was trying to reach Vladivostok, which was still free of the Bolsheviks. The Japanese, however, never returned the money entrusted to them. But where did Petrov get his gold bullion? Well, who knows? There's another speculation as to what happened to at least some of the Kolchak's gold. Before proceeding to Irkutsk, to the eventual demise, Kolchak's forces reached Lake Baikal, and I told you about this lake in my other videos. But I'll remind you, this lake is situated only 70 kilometers away from Irkutsk. The Irkutsk region shapes Baikal in its north and west. The deep lake is protected on all sides by mountains. People of Siberia, they love this great sea, as they call Lake Baikal. And they have an old beautiful song about it. Славное море, священный Baikal. The magnificent Lake Baikal is almost 400 miles long and holds 1/5 of the world's lake waters. Lake Baikal is the world's oldest, deepest, largest, and most unique lake. It is situated nearly in the center of Asia. It's like a huge stone ball set 445 meters above sea level. Now, the lake's maximum depth is 1,637 meters. Baikal is 636 kilometers long, as far as we know, and it's wide, 79 kilometers wide at its widest point. Baikal's water surface is 31,500 square kilometers, so you can hide a lot of things there. Russian and foreign visitors are impressed and charmed by Baikal's grandeur, size, and unusual this might of the Siberian miracle of nature. It had, I don't think it's the case anymore, it had the purest water in the whole world, very transparent and cold, highly saturated with oxygen. It's been polluted lately, and I think the Russian government is trying to do something about it. But the people who comprised Admiral Kolchak's forces and camp followers, they had little reason to be impressed by the ice-covered lake in 1920. Kolchak's troops were exhausted, and for the most part they were in ill health. They wanted to reach Manchuria, where they would feel safe. All they needed to do was to cross the area close to the southern shores of the lake, a short distance. But the territory was under the control of the Red Army. The retreating White Army troops had only one path to safety. They had to cross the frozen lake by foot. The gold and jewels were unloaded from the train and distributed among those officers and soldiers loyal to Admiral Kolchak. Now, there was another account that the gold and jewels were actually loaded in sleds, carriages, and wagons. I, based on my research, find it very questionable. Now, they did not walk away too far, because blowing at them were the terrible cold winds that sweep over the icy fields and ice hummocks of Baikal. The southern part of Baikal is only 30 kilometers wide, but the icy cold winds buried most of the Kolchak's troops, who wanted to cross it to safety. Some of the men survived. Among them were two officers, Bogdanov and Drankovich. In the spring, when the ice melted, the dead White Guard troops drowned, and the gold bullion went down with them. Bodies of those who drowned in the lake are rarely found, because microorganisms in Baikal devour dead flesh within hours. This is one of the reasons why the lake's waters was so pure. But it's always cold, even in the summer. The survivors hid the gold they managed to save in the cellar of a church located somewhere near the shore of the lake. Bogdanov and Drankovich led the soldiers, they were in charge of them, and who saved 200 kilograms of the gold to a nearby sandpit, and then they shot the soldiers to death. They executed them. Soon thereafter, the officers quarreled, and a bloody fight ensued. Bogdanov killed Drankovich and later fled to the United States. As for the territory around Lake Baikal and east of it, from the spring of 1920 until 1922, Kremlin maintained the illusion of a Far Eastern Republic, independent of Soviet Russia. It was done for political reasons. It was like a buffer zone. The region became part of the Soviet Union in 1922, when the Japanese troops left under considerable foreign pressure. Vladivostok was shut off completely to foreigners in 1948, when the main base of the Soviet Pacific Fleet became a closed military zone. In 1959, according to Russian researchers, Bogdanov, under an alias, arrived in the Soviet Union, and with assistance of an American engineer who worked in Russia under a contract, was able to retrieve some of the treasure hidden in the church. They loaded a jeep with 100 kilograms of Kolchak's gold and left. Apparently Bogdanov and the engineer tried to cross the border into Turkey, but the Soviet border troops killed the Russian. The American did make it to Turkey, but left the gold and his vehicle behind. Now, deep underwater exploration of Lake Baikal in the 1970s had revealed a bottle full of gold powder at the depth of 1,000 meters. A gold bar was also detected. However, there is a problem of actually retrieving anything from the bottom of the deep water lake. And I already told you what else Soviets encountered in that lake, but it has nothing to do with Tsar's treasures. But it has everything to do with underwater humanoids. But let's get back to our story now. It is plausible that Admiral Kolchak wanted to assure that at least some of the gold under his control would make it to Manchuria, and sent a convoy comprised of his trusted officers and soldiers across the lake. They didn't make it, but there still may be 100 kilograms of the Russian Imperial Bank's gold in the cellar of a church. Does the church where Kolchak's officers hid the gold still stand in the vicinity of Lake Baikal? Probably the best place to find out about the local history and architecture would be the Taltsi Museum of Architecture and Ethnography, located on the road to Lake Baikal, on the 47th kilometer along the Baikal Highway. The museum's 67-hectare territory is surrounded with a protected area. There are over 40 monuments of architectural heritage and 8,000 exhibits of high historical value. But I suspect that the Russian Federal Security Agency, a Russian secret police, so to say, had already made its inquiries in the museum regarding the old church. Those who have doubts can contact the agency in Irkutsk. It used to be at the Litvinova Street, Building 13. You can ask for the officer in charge of the Department for the Defense of Constitution and Counterterrorism. The purpose of my video is not to send treasure seekers to gallop to Siberia in search of the lost bullion. It belongs to Russia, and its government will someday reclaim whatever was stolen, hidden, or transferred out of the country during the Civil War. But there is another mystery of the missing gold reserve of the Saint Petersburg Mint. In the fall of 1916, it was sent to Moscow on the orders of the Czar, because he feared a German invasion of the Russian capital. There was a very interesting publication about it in Russia back in 1999. I've seen some other reports as well. What happened is that the train carrying this gold reserve left St. Petersburg just before the February 1917 Democratic Revolution. Moscow was no safe place for it either, because the law and order broke down and the city was full of unruly and armed mobs. The train consisted of 3 railroad cars. According to the cargo bills of the Saint Petersburg Mint, there were 1,360 kilograms of gold bars and 67 kilograms of gold coins. The guard consisted of 5 soldiers, a corporal, a lieutenant of the counterintelligence service with them. There was also some woman with them. She was probably a refugee. She joined the guards later on. The officer in charge of the precious cargo was able to communicate with the Tsar and received his direct orders to take the train from Moscow to the Ural Mountains, to the city of Ekaterinburg. There the gold was to be transferred to the Russian Imperial Bank. The officer of the Russian counterintelligence service followed the orders of his Tsar, but the gold disappeared without a trace. Nicholas II was forced to sign a document of abdication after being brought down by political unrest. The Tsar, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters and son Alexis, heir to the throne, became prisoners of the Bolsheviks for several months at the Tsarskaya Selo Palace. That's near St. Petersburg. Later, in August of 1917, the royal family was transported to Siberia to prevent any attempt to restore them to the throne. In April of 1918, the Bolshevik government decided to move the imperial family to Ekaterinburg. In July of 1918, local Bolsheviks in Ekaterinburg executed the entire royal family. under orders of Vladimir Lenin. The bodies were hidden for many years and have only recently been found and identified. And even this is controversial still. But the Bolsheviks, they were full of curiosity and followed the trail of the brave Russian officer and the train with the gold reserve. They kidnapped that officer from China after learning his name in 1919 when the Ekaterinburg Cheka, that was the secret police of the USSR, forerunner of the KGB. When they conducted detailed investigations, they found out about him. Apparently, the young man did not betray his secrets, and the communists were not able to find out where he and his soldiers were hiding the gold. Recently, some Soviet secret archives had been opened up, and Russian historians found out that the Cheka, or the KGB of the time, found out the following information. The officer, who I couldn't find out his name, decided not to trust the gold reserve to the provisional government of Russia. He made a decision to hide it in the soil of the Urals. The train was taken to a branch line of the railroad, and at a remote crossing the guards unloaded their treasure. They hid the gold in the ground, and the corporal and the lieutenant left Russia. They carried a few gold bars each in their bags. The soldiers went home to their families. What happened to their female companion on the train is not clear. Well, the rest is history, an often bloody history of the Soviet Union. And the search for the Tsar's gold has never stopped ever since the secret police learned about its fate. But so far as I know, it has not been found. The missing gold reserve of the Saint Petersburg Mint is hidden somewhere in the in the ground, not far from Ekaterinburg. So there are many mysteries that are hidden in the Ural Mountains, and many bloody pages of the Russian history have been written there. And somewhere there may be gold in the soil of this mysterious part of Russia, just like the Lake Baikal could contain lost gold of Russia's last emperor. I thank you for your attention. Please support my research through the links you will find in the description, and I will bring you more interesting stories about Russia, paranormal and also non-paranormal. Thank you.